Thank you, Bruno. Thank you to all those involved in planning this. You just heard some of their names. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I come here very happy to have been invited, but with a mixture of some sadness at the loss of Stephen Feinstein, who was a friend and more than just that he was a friend, but he was a great figure in the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And your loss is our loss, and your loss is the world's loss in a very, very significant way, and we miss him. I come to you tonight to talk about a trial that happened 50 years ago. And the question, of course, is why is this trial important? And I want to explore that. I will try also to touch on the new anti-Semitism. I don't get to do it in the body of the talk, then certainly in the question and answer session afterwards. Adolf Eichmann, first of all, who was Adolf Eichmann? Adolf Eichmann was not, as the Israelis would charge, as Gideon Hausner would charge in the trial, he was not the chief architect of the final solution. To use more contemporary parlance, I would say that he wasn't the CEO of the final solution. He was one of a number of COOs of the final solution. He was responsible for deportations from the Netherlands, from France, from Belgium, from parts of the Reich, from Greece, and of course, at the very end of the war, when the war is clearly lost by the Germans, of the destruction of the Hungarian Jewish community. He himself is responsible for probably the deportation of and murder of close to 1.5 million Jews. Now, when I say deportation, some would say, well, essentially all he did was to make the trains run on time, but he really did much more than that. As Raoul Hilberg points out, with a very small staff, he coordinated these deportations. He made sure that the camps to which they were being sent had room to, quote unquote, absorb them, in other words, murder them, that the mechanism for murder was in place. He made sure that their properties were taken. He did this with a small staff. He coordinated this, and he was exceptionally successful at it. His first success at it actually came before the final solution itself in March, after March, the Anschluss, after the March 1938 entry of the Germans into Austria, when he oversees the emigration of the Austrian Jewish community and does it and manages at the same time to make a tremendous amount of money for the Germans in so doing. At the end of the war, he knows he's being sought, and he actually is captured at one point and put in an Allied POW camp. He does something there which shows you this man's canniness, I guess would be the right word. When he's put into the camp, he goes into the camp, he says his name is Feichmann, not Eichmann, Feichmann. He said, going under an assumed name. Now, you may laugh, said, what kind of idiot, you know? You pick Müller, or you pick, I don't know, something way different. But he knew that possibly there was a good chance that someone would recognize him in the POW camp, and walking past would say Eichmann, and he would turn his head, and he couldn't turn his head and say, oh, my name is Müller, you know, but he could say, oh no, my name is Feichmann, so it was a way of cover. But then some of his assistants who had been arrested and colleagues who had been arrested began to talk about the role of his office. And it came up at Nuremberg, and he knew that very soon his role would be discovered. So with the help of his fellow prisoners, he escaped from the camp. He spent some time in northern Germany on a timber ranch, which was also giving coverage to other Nazi war criminals. And then when his name came up again, this was at Nuremberg, he said, I have to get out of Germany. He went out of Europe, he went south, and with the help of a Red Cross pass and help from the Vatican, we don't know precisely how high up it went, he emigrates to Argentina under the name Ricardo Clement. Now, why Argentina? Argentina had long been interested in getting European emigres, particularly educated European emigres, in part as a way of building up its country, in part as a way of working in terms of the natural, shall we say, I wouldn't say competition, but the feeling on part of those of European descent in South America, in places like Argentina, other countries as well, that they wanted to build up the European population against the indigenous population. So if you could get an educated European, that was really good. And if that educated European happened to come with a CV that included mass murder, so be it. It was not a terrible thing. He goes to Argentina. He works first as a rancher, does other things. He is not successful. He is not successful economically as the way some of the other Germans who have gone, including former Nazis, who have gone to Argentina, gone to South America, and become quite wealthy. He never becomes he never becomes wealthy at all. He lives in very, very modest circumstances. In fact, at one point, when the Israelis learned that this might be Eichmann, an Israeli operative, security operative, who happens to be in Argentina, sent to drive past his house, and he sends back a message, this could not be Eichmann. Nobody who had access to so many Jewish possessions and so much Jewish wealth throughout Europe, in Netherlands, France, Belgium, the Reich, et cetera, would live in such ramshackled, modest circumstances. But it was Eichmann. Now, how was he found out? A number of people from the periphery, as I like to call them, play an important role. There is a German family in Argentina. Lothar Hermann is the father's name. He and his wife come to Argentina immediately after Kristallnacht. He is Jewish, she is not. And they decide to hide his Jewish identity, to not talk about it, to live as Christians. And they have a young daughter shortly thereafter, and they just decide that this is not a world in which you want to raise a child as a Jew, particularly in Argentina with a large German population. Their daughter Sylvie, her natural social milieu is the German expat, children of the German expat community. She begins to date at one point a young man named Nick. She brings him home to the house at some time, and Nick says to the father, who by the way is also practically blind, says to the father that the Germans should have killed the Jews when they had the chance and finished the job. He's very vague about what his father did during the war. And his last name is Nick Eichmann. But it's not a name that's commonly known. People think, well, how come Lothar Hermann didn't immediately say, Eichmann, this must be Eichmann's son? Because Eichmann was not the name of the profile of a Himmler or a Goebbels or a Göring or many other leading Nazis. He was, as I say, an operative down a couple of levels. But sometime after that, Lothar Hermann reads in one of the German-language Argentinian newspapers that trials are begun to be organized in the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. And amongst the people, that the person organizing the trial is named Fritz Bauer. He's the prosecutor in Hessen. And one of the people he would like to try, but he doesn't know where he is Adolf Eichmann, and explains who Adolf Eichmann was. And Lothar Hermann says, Nicholas Eichmann, they should have killed all the Jews, vague about what his father was. And also the other thing that has piqued Lothar Hermann's interest is the fact that Sylvie doesn't know where Nick lives. She doesn't have the exact address. And when the two want to communicate with each other, they have to write through a third party, through a friend of Nick's. So all this seems very strange. Lothar Hermann writes this information to Fritz Bauer. Fritz Bauer writes back and says, I'm very interested. Could you get me more information? At one point, Lothar Hermann and Sylvie, they live outside of Buenos Aires. They come to Buenos Aires, and she by herself goes to Eichmann's home under the pretense of looking for Nick. Nick isn't there, but his uncle, so as he introduces himself, his uncle, Ricardo Clement, is there. She sits with him. She talks to him. It's clearly Eichmann. And then Nick comes and says, what are you doing here? And I'll walk you to the bus, and takes her away. This information is passed on to Bauer, who passes, and other information as well, who passes it on to the Israelis. And it's very interesting what the Israeli reaction. The Israeli reaction essentially is to do nothing. The Israelis don't react to it. They don't act. Isser Harel, who at that point is head of the security services, both the Shin Bet and the Mossad, which are together at that point, makes the following calculation. He says, I could spend my time tracking down enemies of the Jewish people who have done us harm in the past, or I could spend my time tracking down enemies of the Jewish people who want to do us harm in the present. How should I use my limited resources? I will use my limited resources to track down those who want to harm us in the present. So they don't act on the information. Bauer passes on more information. Again, nothing happens. Eventually, he comes to Israel, and he meets with the Minister of Justice, who summons Harel to his office. Harel, who was used to only answering to Ben-Gurion, goes rather grudgingly. And at that meeting, first of all, Bauer says to Harel that a flat-footed German policeman could have done a better job than the Israelis have done with the information he's given them. And second of all, he gives Harel other information which confirms for Harel that this indeed is Eichmann. It's not just the information that's been garnered from Lothar Hermann. It's other information, and Harel is convinced that this indeed is Adolf Eichmann. He then goes to Ben-Gurion. And Ben-Gurion at that point, and this is one of the, Ben-Gurion today in history is often much criticized, but here's a moment, I think, of his greatness. David Ben-Gurion could have said to Isser Harel, you know what? Let this guy disappear into a ditch. We'll send some guys down to Argentina. He comes home from work one night. Let him just end up in a sewage ditch and dead. And let it be a message to other German war criminals, Nazi war criminals, that don't sleep so soundly in your beds. We will find you. We will get you. We may not get you today, we may not get you tomorrow, but eventually we will find you, and we will get you, and we will apprehend you. But Ben-Gurion doesn't say that. Ben-Gurion says, find him, get him out of Argentina, bring him to Israel, and we will put him on trial. Ben-Gurion doesn't say, as he will later claim, he said he wanted to do this to educate the next generation, and later he will talk about this, but he doesn't talk about it at the beginning. He just has a sense that this is putting him on trial is an important thing. It is an important thing for justice. It is an important thing for establishing the sovereignty of the Jewish state. It's an important thing for establishing the Jewish state, for the state of Israel, as the representative of those who had been murdered by the Nazis. So Harel has to figure out a way of getting him out. They set up a team. You may know the story from the house on Garibaldi Street. As he's walking home from the bus, they pounce on him, bundle him into a car, take him to a safe house, hold him there for about a week. And then at the end of that week, as luck would have it, it is the time of Argentina celebrating its independence, and Israel, with whom Argentina has good relations, is sending a delegation headed by, I think it's then Minister of Culture, Abba Eban, and Abba Eban is coming with a delegation on an El Al plane. It will land in Buenos Aires, and then the next day will return to Israel. The delegation will remain. And so Harel knows of this, and he tells El Al when they return to Israel, it will take back certain Israelis who have to be brought back, a group of Israelis who have to be brought back to Israel. They drug Eichmann, and they half comatose. They dress him in a El Al steward's uniform, and they bring him onto the plane. They get him onto the plane, and the plane takes off. Officially, the plane is supposed to stop in Brazil for refueling before flying to Dakar and then on to Israel. But Harel says, don't stop in Brazil. It would be too easy for the Argentinians. They know, Eichmann's family knows he's gone. Eichmann's family alerts a whole group of Nazi, former Nazis, Nazi sympathizers, etc. They're looking for him, and Harel says it'd be just too easy. Once we leave Argentina airspace, we've got to leave and go straight to Israel. They do and they refuel in Dakar, and then they go on to Israel. By the time they land in Israel, they're flying on both places. They're flying on fumes. When they land at Lud Airport, as the airport was then known, Eichmann is taken to the Akko prison, which has been prepared for him. A wing in the Akko prison has been prepared for him. And Harel goes to see Ben-Gurion to inform him that they've returned and Eichmann is in their hands. And at that point, Harel asks that the information about Eichmann not be released, that Ben-Gurion not say anything for a couple of days, because he's left some of his team in Argentina to break down the safe house, to cover their tracks, to make sure that their identity won't be known, et cetera. And these gentlemen are leaving, and a woman as well, are leaving Argentina through different routes. Some are taking a train out, some are going out by other flights. They're leaving separately, et cetera. And he says, I promised them that I would make sure the information stayed private, stayed out of the public eye until they were all safely out of Argentina. Ben-Gurion says to Harel, how many people know that Eichmann is here? He said, well, all the people on the plane, the crew, was told by the pilot at one point. I gave the pilot permission because they knew something was weird. A guy was sitting in first class with a blindfold on and being given cigarettes, to calm him down, to keep him calm, etc. Certainly some of the people at Akko knew that if they didn't know the name Eichmann, they knew that this was a German prisoners, etc. So Ben-Gurion said, Harel said, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 people maximum. So Ben-Gurion said, by tomorrow, the whole country will know. So he, or in a few days, the whole country will know. So he goes to the Knesset on the next day, and in a two-line sentence, he says something to the effect of, Adolf Eichmann has come into our hands. Very strange construct, whether you look at the Hebrew or the English translation, the French, doesn't matter what translation. It's very weird. He doesn't say we captured Adolf Eichmann. The official story that Ben-Gurion tries to put out is that a group of volunteers went to Argentina, found Eichmann, and that Eichmann voluntarily agreed to come to Israel. One of the members of the Shin Bet said, Bubba-meises, grandmother stories, or as you say in Hebrew, lo dubim v'lo yar, there weren't bears and there wasn't a forest, but otherwise the story is true. But that's the official story Israel tries to put out there, and of course no one believes it. But then Argentina, which, as I say, with whom Israel has relations, is very upset and very angry, and takes it to the Security Council. And at the Security Council, it argues that, in fact, the Argentinian representative to the Security Council is a Peronist who was very simpatico with the Nazis. So for him, he's really livid. And Golda Meir comes to New York to present the Israeli case. And at one point, the Argentinian representative says that the crimes that Eichmann is being charged at are as bad as what Israel's done. And of course, Golda Meir does not take this very kindly. It looks like the Security Council will press Israel to return Eichmann to Argentina, which Israel would not have done, but it would have been a very bad thing had that been the decision. And at that point, Richard Nixon, Vice President Nixon, calls Henry Cabot Lodge, who was our representative to the UN, who he has designated to be his, probably to be his running mate when he runs for the presidency in 1960. He says to Henry Cabot Lodge, are you still interested in being my running mate? And Henry Cabot Lodge says yes. He says, well, find some way to fix this so Eichmann doesn't get sent back to Argentina. So Henry Cabot Lodge works out a compromise that Argentina will accept Israel's apology in the Security Council, and that will close the matter. As one pundit put it, Argentina got its apology and Israel got its man, and that essentially closes the matter, and eventually Israel will rebuild relations with Argentina, but it takes quite a while for that to happen. Now, Israel faces certain problems, strategic and tactical and legal, mainly legal problems on how to set up this trial. But first, there are questions also of the legality of Israel having this trial. Some people say, well, Israel didn't exist at the time of these crimes. The crimes weren't committed on Israeli territory. They weren't committed against Israeli citizens. There were no Israeli citizens at the time. And so it's wrong for Israel to have the trial. Many people take issue with this, including Hannah Arendt, who argues that that is a ludicrous position to take, that this is the country in which you have the more people who were directly affected by the final solution than any other place. And that one of the other complaints, of course, comes that you can't have this trial in an Israeli court because the judges will be Jews and they won't be fair. And again, Arendt, who will later be very critical, I'll talk about her in a moment, says that, she points out that when the Poles conducted trials immediately after the war, or the Czechs conducted trials immediately after the war, no one said the Polish judges can't be neutral and can't be fair, and the Czech judges can't be fair, even though they were victims. Why is this question coming up when it's the Jews? But more importantly, the question comes up of who was going to defend Eichmann? Who was going to prosecute him? Who's going to sit in judgment? Where will the trial be? In terms of a defense attorney, Israel is very anxious to make this as fair a trial as possible. And in order for it to be a fair trial, of course, remember this is 1960, 61, the trial being 61, this is 1960, when this conversation is going on. This is the time shortly after the Gulag, the Stalin trials, the show trials. The last thing Israel wants is to appear to be a show trial. So it knows that Eichmann has to have a good defense. But it's also loath, in fact, not only loath, opposed to the notion or to the idea that a former Nazi, a member of the Nazi Party, will come and represent him. This is something that Israel just can't accept. Excuse me. Consequently, a number of Israeli lawyers come forward to offer to defend Eichmann, not because they have any, sympathy for Eichmann, but just feeling that the guy has to have a defense if this is going to be a fair trial. The Israeli authorities, the Justice Ministry, and even Ben-Gurion are reluctant to let an Israeli represent Eichmann, in part because this is just a few years after the murder of Rudolf Kastner. And if you remember the Kastner trial, Rudolf Kastner was the one who actually, Hungarian Jew, who negotiated with Eichmann the Trucks for Lives to try to exchange Hungarian Jews for goods. And in the spring of 1944, when the destruction of Hungarian Jews was taking place, he does manage to save 1,600 Jews, more Jews than anybody else rescued in the entire war. But many Hungarian Jews felt that he could have warned them more dramatically and told them more explicitly what was going to happen, and they would never have gotten on the trains, et cetera, et cetera. At one point, Kastner sues a Hungarian Jew who has written very critical things about him for libel. Kastner loses the trial, but appeals to the High Court. While this is in appeal, he's murdered on the streets of Tel Aviv outside his apartment. And the Israeli authorities fear that someone will be so upset at some Israeli lawyer defending Eichmann that the same thing might happen, and they just don't want a repetition. So the Eichmann family really solves the problem for them by proposing a man named Robert Servatius, a German lawyer who had not been a member of the Nazi Party but had defended some of the Nuremberg defendants. So he was acceptable to the Israelis. But the question was, who was going to pay him? Now, generally, Germany paid the defense costs of German citizens who were accused of crimes outside of Germany. But the last thing Konrad Adenauer wanted was any connection with this trial. In fact, when there was criticism of Israel holding the trial, many people said, well, where else should it be? And many people said it should be in Germany. Well, it's ludicrous. Adenauer didn't want anything to do with this trial. He didn't want anything to do with Eichmann. He didn't want it because he was afraid it would shine a spotlight, or Eichmann would stand up and say, I'm in the box, and your chief of staff, which was true, a man named Hans Globke, was a member of the Nazi judiciary system, and in fact was responsible for writing the Nuremberg laws. Or that man over there ran a camp, or that man over over there was Ribbentrop's assistant, etc. So Adenauer didn't want this trial and didn't want any connection, and the Germans did not want to pay for Eichmann's defense because they thought that would bring him closer to him. So they said, because he escaped from Germany, we're not responsible to pay for the defense. So Israel ended up paying for the defense. But what about the judges? There was a problem with the judges. Now, the trial was going to be held in Jerusalem. That was clear from the outset. And by Israeli protocols, the judge should have been the president of the Jerusalem District Court, who was a man named Benjamin Halevi. German-born, been in Israel for many years. The problem with Halevi was that Halevi had been the judge in the Kastner trial. And he had found against Kastner, and in his finding, in his decision, he had said about Kastner, machar et nafsho la Satan. He sold his soul to the Satan. Who was Satan? Eichmann. So you have a judge presiding in a trial who has already termed the defendant Satan. Doesn't quite work. Everyone asked Halevi to step aside. Halevi refused. He says, because this is not about what my decision was in the Kastner trial. This is because in the Kastner trial, I allowed Ben-Gurion and the Labor government to be embarrassed. He was not a member of the Labor Party, et cetera. He said this is a political thing, and he refused to step aside. So the Knesset passed a law saying that in a case where the punishment might be a capital case, where there might be a death sentence, that a member of the High Court had to preside. So Moshe Landau, who just died about 4 months ago at the age of 99, was appointed the presiding judge, and Halevi became one of the members of the tribunal, and the judge from the Tel Aviv District Court, Raveh, became the third judge. But then there was a question of where to hold it. The courtrooms in Jerusalem at that point were in the Russian compound. I don't know how many of you know the Russian compound. It's been somewhat renovated because it's now in a very important part of the town, but for many years, certainly in the 60s, it was right at the border. It was right at the edge of the foot of Rehov Yafo. It was old, it was run down, it was decrepit. The courtrooms were small, were tiny little courtrooms, so it was totally inappropriate for holding a trial where the world media was clearly planning to show up, and they knew that would be the case. So Ben-Gurion had a young man who worked in his office find another appropriate venue in Jerusalem. And at that point, a cultural center was being built, Beit Ha'am, which, if you know the geography of Jerusalem, it's right behind the park next to the old Knesset, up on that sort of rise as you head towards the market Machane Yehuda. It was being built. This person who was the head of Ben-Gurion's office ascertained that it would be finished in time, and I think the biggest miracle of this whole story, it was finished in time, it was ready. So that was the place that the trial was held in, Beit Ha'am. That man, by the way, was Teddy Kollek, who goes on to be mayor of Jerusalem. So, and then who was going to be the prosecutor? Israel had just appointed a new attorney general. He was a political choice as a member of the cabinet, and it's always a political choice. And he was the first choice and second choice had not been confirmed for various reasons, there had been opposition to them, et cetera. So he was the third choice. He was a commercial lawyer. He had never tried a criminal case, and everybody thought he would assign it to somebody in his office who had done criminal cases, but he said, no, he was going to try it. His name was Gideon Hausner. So after a number of months, the players are in place, the venue is in place, but then the indictment. What should be the indictment? Now here, Hausner, who was writing the indictment, was determined to do things very differently than Nuremberg. At the Nuremberg tribunals, the main accusations had been crimes against peace, raging a war of aggression, belonging to criminal enterprise, et cetera. And down the line, number 4 had been crimes against humanity, which were crimes against the handicapped, crimes against the gypsies, crimes against the Jews, a whole litany of things of which the final solution was one of them. So it was a subset, it was a sidebar. Of course, Hausner turned it around and he made the crime against the Jewish people the first number of counts, different aspects of it, of the indictment. He also included crimes against other peoples, Gypsies, Slovenians, others that Eichmann had been involved in killing, but those came much later down in the in the indictment. So that was one dramatic change, but there was a much more important, and I think this goes to the heart of what I have to say tonight, a decision that Hausner made. And it was a strategic decision for how he was going to run or tactical decision, how he was going to run the trial. It didn't shape the judge's decision, but it shaped history. And that was in contrast to Nuremberg, where from the very outset, the opening day at Nuremberg, Justice Jackson, who was the American prosecutor in Nuremberg, and you can see how important Harry Truman, one of the first things Harry Truman does when he takes office after the death of Roosevelt, he has to appoint an American prosecutor for Nuremberg, and he asked Justice Jackson, a sitting member of the Supreme Court, to leave the Supreme Court for the time of the trial and to go and represent us in Nuremberg at these international military tribunals. And at the opening, Jackson and the other prosecutors say, we will convict these defendants not on the basis of what others say about them, but on the basis of what they said themselves, of the documents they signed, of the statements they made. So Nuremberg is essentially a document-based trial. The Eichmann trial will be a document-based trial. They will use all the Nuremberg documents and others as well, but it also will be a trial of witnesses, of survivors, of victims, of people who can testify in the first person singular, who will tell the story of the final solution of the Holocaust from its outset to its conclusion as a personal story. They will tell aspects of the final solution with which Eichmann had no connection. But that was because the Israelis were presenting him Israel was presenting him as the architect of the final solution. They will tell that story with a great deal of power. There will be moments that will be riveting in the courtroom as these witnesses tell their story. And I'll talk about those witnesses for in a moment. But first I want to talk about a very powerful moment that I really didn't focus on in my trial. But a couple of weeks ago I spoke at Loyola Law School, and it was a conference, and a guest of honor at the conference was a man named Gabriel Bach, who is a retired member of the Israeli High Court, but in 1961 was the assistant prosecutor at the Eichmann trial. And he was also the legal representative or the legal advisor when the police were cross-examining Eichmann. In short, he says that probably over a period of a year, if not more than that, he saw Eichmann on a daily basis. And he recalled for me the opening moments of the trial. And he said, there we were in this large theater in Beit Ha'am. Landau the day before had said, take out the red carpet, the traditional red carpet that goes down the center. He said, it's not a theater, it's going to be a courtroom, and we have to make it look as much. The room is packed. The only decoration in the room is the symbol of the State of Israel behind the bench where the judges will sit. There are television cameras, but they're camouflaged behind the wall. And for Bach said, the opening moment when the judges walked in and everybody stood, including Adolf Eichmann. And he says, looking at Adolf Eichmann standing before those three judges who themselves were standing before the symbol of the State of Israel, he said for him that was the moment of the trial. What do some of those witnesses address? Well, as I say, they address many aspects, and I talk about it in my book, but there's some riveting moments for me, particularly in reading about it. One of the unspoken, or somewhat spoken, but unspoken in that courtroom, one of the unspoken issues, but in Israel generally, was what was wrong with these victims that they didn't fight back? Why didn't they resist? In the minds of certainly Sabars of the Israeli-born generation, the generation born in the wake of the Holocaust, how could it be possible that all these people, quote unquote, let themselves be taken like sheep to the slaughter? I put that in quotation marks. The person who actually made that statement first was Abba Kovner, who led the Vilna resistance when he said, let us not be taken like sheep to the slaughter. Hausner addressed that. And when he did it, it was quite controversial because it happened at one moment in the trial when a man named Moshe Beisky, who will eventually go on to be a member of the High Court, but at that point was a magistrate in Tel Aviv, a much loved, respected and magistrate in Tel Aviv, comes to give testimony. And he comes into the witness box. The judges say to him, Magistrate Beisky, you may sit if you wish. And he said, no, I will stand. He's a man of the court. He wants to give the court the respect he feels it is due. So he stands for a better part of an hour and dispassionately describes what had happened to him. And he speaks not in full sentences, but in fully crafted paragraphs. I read both the translation. I also read the Hebrew of his testimony. And he is dispassionate. He's telling fact by fact. He is a very, very good witness. And then at one point, he comes to the point where he's describing how 15,000 prisoners were held in a camp, he's one of them, under the guard of the SS men armed with machine guns and bayonets, and they're forced to watch as a young boy is brought out to be hung. And the boy is held up, and Beisky says he was lifted onto a high chair and was placed under the rope. The child began to beg for mercy. The rope broke, and an order was given to hang him a second time. And Beisky is just beginning to describe this when Hausner pounces. And he says, 15,000 people stood there, and opposite them only hundreds of guards. Why didn't you attack? Why didn't you revolt? And Beisky struggles to respond. The man who was the articulate witness was replaced by a rebroken man who groped for words. This was in the third year of the war. Nevertheless, there was still hope. Here were people working on forced labor. They apparently needed this work, possibly, maybe. And then he stops and he turns to Judge Landau and he says, may I sit? And then he sits and he goes on. I can't describe the terror-inspiring fear. Nearby us, there was a Polish camp. There were 1,000 Poles. 100 meters beyond the camp, they had a place to go to, their homes. I don't recall one instance of escape on the part of the Poles. But where could any Jew go? We were wearing clothes which were dyed yellow with yellow stripes. Our hair at the center, they made a kind of swath in a stripe of 4 centimeters. And at that point, let's suppose that the 15,000 people with the camp even succeeded without armed strength to go beyond the boundaries of the camp. What could they do? Where could they go? It was a powerful statement. Some people took Hausner's task for asking that. I don't think Hausner asked that because he was asking in the Sabra kind of way, why didn't you fight back? He wanted to show how impossible the odds were. He had come to understand by listening to these victims, by meeting with them, by hearing their testimony, helping them prepare to testify. He had come to understand the overwhelming odds, and that was one of his efforts to try to educate the Israeli public. At another point, a man named Martin Foldy, a Hungarian, testifies, and the Hungarian, as I mentioned earlier, the Hungarian murders Eichmann coordinates those. It is the murder of Hungarian Jews which gives Auschwitz its place of, quote unquote, so to speak, honor in the killing fields of the world when close to 500,000 people are murdered in the space of 7 weeks in the spring and early summer of 44. Martin Foldy survives, and he describes how he watches his wife and 2 children on another line. He doesn't know, of course, at that point that line is to the gas chambers. He said, I watched as they walked further and further away until they were quite far from where I stood, but I kept them in my sight. And Gabriel Bach, who was questioning him at that point, says, well, how could you keep them in your life? It was so crowded, so many thousands of people, and they were so far away. And he said a few days before this, we had bought my little girl a red coat. And I was able to keep her in my vision because of the red coat. And of course, that red coat makes its reprise, its reappearance in Spielberg's Schindler's List, when Spielberg moves it, of course, into the ghetto in Krakow. One of the other powerful moments of testimony comes when the son of Rabbi Melchior, the father of the current, someone who goes on to be a member of the Israeli Knesset, comes to give testimony. And he gives testimony about what happened in Denmark in the days of when the Jews learned that they are about to be deported. And he tells the story of how his father gives warning to the He's going to give warning. It's Rosh Hashanah, Erev Rosh Hashanah, and Rosh Hashanah night. He's going to give warning to the Danish Jews not to go back to their homes, to escape, and not to return to their homes. And he describes, first of all, he describes on the day, Erev Rosh Hashanah, he knows that that night he and his family will be escaping. And he describes his day, and he says at one point he went to the university, he's a university student, to return some library books. I always think that was I describe it in the book as an aggravated sense of responsibility. I mean, I believe in returning library books. God knows I hate it when I want a book and it's not there. But if you're escaping because you're afraid of being deported, I don't know how important it is to return the books, but he does. And he says that when he goes to the library, he stopped twice in the space of 10 minutes by two different groups of students whom he only knew by sight. He didn't know by name. They weren't friends of his. And they said, in case there is anything at all we can do, you can get in touch with us. Here is how to get in touch with us. And he goes on to say, during the preceding 3.5 years of the occupation, there was not a single moment when the population was united so closely together as it was during the rescue of the Jews. He talks about how old, young, rich, poor, people of all sorts, everyone banded together to help the Jews hide and then escape. Chaim Guri, who was a reporter, a poet and a reporter, who was covering writing color, aspects of the trial for Davar, for Israeli newspaper, described that moment as artificial respiration. Was the moment of uplift. And he also, in the courtroom, he said there was a woman sitting in front of him who was weeping during Melchior's testimony. And when Melchior finished, Guri leaned over and said, "Are you all right?" And she said, "Yes, I'm okay. I cry when people are kind to me." So, what about Hannah Arendt? That's if there's a 900-pound gorilla. No, I shouldn't say that. I don't mean that. That was bad. Scratch that. Let's start over again. Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, the German-born political philosopher who has escaped from Germany in 1933. She's working with the German Zionist youth organization. She's afraid she's going to be arrested for her work with them. She escapes to Paris. She spends the next couple of years in Paris. When the Germans got to France, she escapes again and manages to come to the United States with her husband. She works for Schocken Books, my own publisher, for a while, and then writes for the Aufbau, a German-language Jewish newspaper, and eventually will go on to get an academic position at Princeton and University of Chicago. She will be Princeton's first woman tenured full professor. When the trial is announced, she feels she must be there to cover it. She hasn't gotten to Nuremberg, and she feels she owes it to herself to be there to see this criminal, to be there to witness this. She goes first to Norman Podhoretz and proposes covering it for commentary. Podhoretz says no for whatever reason, and you sometimes wonder what would her book have been like had she written it for Podhoretz. But then she goes to the New Yorker, and Sean, the editor, long-term editor, agrees to have her cover it for the New Yorker, and she writes a multi-part series of 5-part series on the trial, which is then published as Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. It's a book that has the strange distinction of being known by one of the only books I know that's known by its subtitle more than its title. Arendt, in many respects, has become many people's, the prism through which many people's view of this trial is refracted. When I told people I was writing a book on Eichmann, they would say, "Oh, and what about Arendt?" As if that was the only thing that shouldn't this be a book about Eichmann and Arendt or whatever? And she has become the measure. Now, first of all, as I said earlier, she supports the idea of having the trial in Israel. She thinks the criticism against it being in Israel is just gratuitous and formalistic and meaningless. But she's very upset. She's upset that Eichmann is charged with things, or things are discussed in the trial which Eichmann clearly had nothing to do with. She cannot stand Hausner, whom she sees as a bit of a strutting peacock. She also describes him at one point as a Galician Jew who probably knows no languages. Of course, he's conducting the trial in Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, English, and German. But probably what she meant by that is his German wasn't perfect. But in any case, she has taken great criticism. She's been criticized severely for what she wrote. And that's primarily because of what she wrote, amongst other things, two aspects. One, that she wrote about the Jewish councils. She talked about the Jewish councils in the ghettos. The Germans established Jewish councils, first of Jewish leaders, and as those people sometimes refused to do the job, they put other people in it to administer the ghettos for them. And eventually, their job is to decide to make up the lists of who goes on the trains. And she talks about them in the harshest of fashion. She said, if the Jewish people had been really unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million people. At that point, the numbers varied. She talks about the Jews in the ghetto facing two enemies, the Nazis and the leaders of the Judenrat. And what she does is paint the Jewish councils who vary dramatically with a very broad brush. Some of those councils worked with the resistance, helped the resistance, and some were like a Chaim Runkowski, who was seen as almost a despot. They were of different sorts, and she really writes about them, I think, in a far too harsh and unfair, historically incorrect. That's the most important thing. Unfair and not fair is a subjective thing. She's wrong on so much of her history. She's also wrong about Eichmann. She looks at Eichmann, she sees him, not the banality, by the way, and this she's taken an unfair rap on. She's not talking about what he did as banal. She's talking as banal. She's talking about he himself is banal. He's a nothing. She sees him as a clown who, had he been told to love the Jews, he would have loved the Jews. Had been told to hate the Jews and kill the Jews, he kills the Jews. She misses his deep-seated anti-Semitism. She misses the passion he brought to this job. And it's obvious. I think it's there. She can't see it. She won't see it. She won't recognize it. She talks about things like the Sonderkommandos, the Jews who worked in the camps who ran the gas chambers, as people. Well, they were immoral, she says, but they were criminal elements. So what they did, the actual work of killing, she says, was no moral problem because it was done by these criminal elements. Primo Levi, the late Primo Levi, writes shortly after her articles come out, and her book comes out, something that may have been directed directly at Arendt. He writes, no one, about the Sonderkommandos, no one is authorized to judge them, not even those who lived through the experiences of the lager, the camp, and even less those who did not live through it. I would invite anyone who dares pass judgment to imagine, if he can, that he lived for months or years in a ghetto, tormented by chronic hunger, fatigue, promiscuity, and humiliations, that he has seen die around him one by one his beloved, that he is cut off from the world, unable to receive or transmit news, that finally he is loaded on a train, 80 or 100 persons to a boxcar, that he travels towards the unknown blindly, for sleepless days and nights, and that he is thrown at last inside the walls of an indecipherable inferno. I am sure, Levy writes this in '86, that he is responding to a person like Arendt. But at the same time, and Arendt is cruel about some of the other witnesses as well, but at the same time, many people have missed aspects of what she said that I think give a slightly more nuanced, and we have to have a slightly more nuanced view of her. First of all, in one paragraph in her book, she captures the importance and the meaning of this trial, certainly from the perspective of Jewish history. She writes, "For the first time since the year 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, Jews were able to sit in judgment on crimes committed against their own people by a non-Jew. For the first time, they did not need to appeal to others for protection and justice, or fall back upon the compromised phraseology of the rights of man. Rights which, as no one knew better than they, were claimed only by people who were too weak to defend their rights and enforce their own laws." If you have a police force, if you have judges, if you have courts, you don't have to fall back and claim rights of man, rights of man. You only do that when you're weak, as she noted. And it was this really that is, Ben-Gurion couldn't have written it better. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews could sit in judgment of a non-Jew who had done them wrong. She also is very, very powerful when she writes, she cannot stand Abba Kovner's testimony. Abba Kovner, who is an Israeli poet, a resistance fighter, very important figure in Israel, he doesn't testify, he gives a speech, he orates. And she can't stand this doesn't belong in a courtroom. But there's one moment of Kovner's testimony which captures her. And when he tells the story of Anton Schmidt, a German sergeant who helped the Jews, who supplied Jews with money, arms, forged papers until he's caught and he's executed. And Arendt writes, and he did it for no financial gain. He would not accept any money or anything from the Jews for that. And she writes with uncharacteristic emotion about Kovner's telling the story, what happens when Coffman tells the story of Anton Schmidt. A hush settled over the courtroom. It was as if though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmidt. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, a single thought stood out, clearly, irrefutable, beyond question. How utterly different everything would be today in this courtroom, in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all the countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told. If there's any lesson to be gleaned from the Holocaust, that's it. If there were more Anton Schmidts, the story would be very different. And she goes on to write that Germans will tell you that most people will comply. They will not tell you, and she puts it in quotation, in italics, some will not. She said they will tell you it could have happened anywhere, but it didn't happen everywhere. And she is utterly devastating in her criticism of Adenauer. She said the Israelis had to go searching for a Nazi. In Germany, you don't have to go searching. They're everywhere. But nobody will find them. So I think that, and she is very supportive of the death penalty. But for her, the penalty is not crimes against the Jewish people, but crimes against humanity perpetrated on the Jewish people. And partially it's because she cannot see the anti-Semitism implicit in what Eichmann and the Final Solution was all about. But her work, she deserves great criticism for her historical mistakes, great criticism for her comments of things about the Judenrat and others, but also credit for some of the other things she said, which I think are powerful and have been lost in the criticism of her. What then, to close, what then is the impact of this trial? It's as I said earlier this evening, for the first time, it's not the first time survivors speak. Many people say before that survivors never spoke. Not true. They spoke, they wrote, but for the first time, the world listened in a way that it had never listened before. Certainly the Jewish people listened, but it wasn't just the Jewish people. It wasn't just Israel and the Jewish people. It was much of the world as well. They heard the story. They understood the magnitude of the Final Solution. Even in Germany, where there had been tendencies to say, well, it wasn't as bad, it wasn't as much, there was a feeling that this was truly something significant. It was the films of the trial were broadcast on German television on a nightly basis. It didn't break a depth of silence. It broke a depth of unwillingness to listen. And if today in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, or wherever the court is having its hearings, there's a concept of the right of the victim. It isn't only responsible, the Eichmann trial isn't the only thing responsible for that. But if there is a sense when we talk about genocide, of the importance of hearing from the victim, that it's not just about the perpetrators, but it's about those who suffered and what happened to them, that whole sentiment, I would argue, begins with the Eichmann trial and continues long thereafter. And in closing, let me read to you how that notion was reaffirmed for me even before I had decided to write this book. A number of years ago, I was invited to a conference at Yad Vashem. While there, I met a group of young Rwandans who had asked Yad Vashem to train them in how to conduct oral testimonies with trauma victims. They wanted to ensure that the history of the genocide that had decimated their country and their families would be preserved. Yad Vashem, eager to make them feel comfortable, arranged for them to have dinner on their first night in Jerusalem with French-speaking Holocaust survivors. By the end of the dinner, the two groups of survivors had bonded so strongly that the elderly survivors took the young Rwandans under their wings, invited them to their homes, introduced them to their families, and began to build personal relations. One afternoon, I sat with some of the Rwandans outside of Yad Vashem, looking over the Judean hills. They told me of their experiences during the genocide and their meeting with the Holocaust survivors. One young man whose entire family had been murdered said to me, "I want to tell my story and help my fellow Rwanda survivors tell theirs. Just like the Holocaust survivors, I want people to listen to me as they listened to them." Despite the inherent contradiction in his next statement, I completely understood what he meant and recognized the passion with which he said it. I had heard it many times before from Holocaust survivors. Future generations, those who were not there, must remember, and we who were there must tell them. This may be the most enduring legacy of what occurred in Jerusalem in 1961. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. My name is Barbara Fry, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Program here on campus, and it's my great honor to have the chance to kind of mediate the questions and answer session. So thank you so much for really a spectacular presentation of a very interesting story. Mm-hmm. Trials have that impact of stories, and you've talked a little bit about both the symbolic value of this trial and also its legacy. But I wonder if, could you explore that a little bit and tell us about how the Eichmann trial was received in the community, in Israel, in sort of a day-to-day basis, and also in the international community right. in that particular era?
Well, that's an very important question. First of all, on the opening day of the Eichmann trial, there were more reporters assembled in Jerusalem from throughout the world than had been at Nuremberg. So it gives you a sense of the interest. Now, of course, 2 days later, next day, the Russians shoot Yuri Gagarin into space. The next week, just to put it in context, the next week is 2 weeks later is the Bay of Pigs. So there are other things competing for the front page. But many of the reporters stay. Some of them are annoyed because Hausner goes through long legal discourses, and they've come to hear stories and not legal discourses, et cetera. Trials, by the way, can be very boring. I know that for a fact, even when you're the defendant. Or tedious, maybe not boring. But it's heard in different ways. In Israel, there's a great deal of attention paid to it. I think, but what many scholars have pointed out, and I think that they're right in this when they look at the Israeli scene, that this was the beginning of, it didn't happen overnight. We historians know nothing happened. Very few things happen overnight, maybe coup d'etats, but that's it. But this was the beginning of a growing tolerance in Israel and understanding in Israel for the European generations, for those who had, in other words, in Israel there was a sense of, we fought 5 enemies and we fought 5 Arab nations just a few years ago, and we managed to do that. Why couldn't they do that? There was a growing recognition of there but for fortune go I. It took a long time for that to emerge. But there are certain scholars who believe that this was the creation of a more tolerant attitude in Israel towards those who had survived the Holocaust. Again, didn't change overnight by a long shot, but it begins then. In terms of the world, I think it's the world's recognition of what the Holocaust was all about. Not fully, not in the same depth that certainly people who were children of survivors or Jews might have recognized, but a much, much more explicit recognition, as opposed to the Germans did many bad things, and amongst them the killing of the Jews. It has a big impact in Germany. Though what has a greater impact in Germany than the Eichmann trial is, and it's embarrassing to say this, but NBC Holocaust. If you remember that terrible soap opera, which we now, you read it, watch it now, and you'll say, how could this have affected us so? But that really has an impact. But that comes much later to a different generation. But I think for the world itself, it's the beginning of a deeper understanding of what the Holocaust was all about.
Because in the Nuremberg trials, the term Holocaust hadn't even
not at all,
existed.
not at all. But there is, you can even see Lawrence Douglas of Amherst pointed this out to me recently, that even in Nuremberg, where they don't talk about, where the prosecutors don't talk about the Holocaust at all in their opening statements, after going through the evidence, by the end, in their conclusions, they're talking about it more.
Interesting.
So it's laying it out in what we now take so matter-of-factly in a way that hadn't been the case previously.
Great. Well, we're going to open it up for questions. There are microphones going around, and if somebody wants to get the first question, I'm going to ask you for, because I have students in the audience, and there are a number of students in the audience, talk about how you do this research, how you put together a book like this.
Well, this book was, I read the transcripts of the trial. I read them in Hebrew, and then I read the English translations as well. There's a very good English translation that's been done by the Ministry of Justice in Israel. I watched the clips of the trial, because watching the clips is different. You can see body language, you can see different things. I read virtually everything I put my hands on people who were at the trial, who witnessed the trial, who reported on the trial. I spoke to some people. I spoke to Gavi Bach, who was the prosecutor. I did not speak to Landau. I'm sorry I didn't, but he was quite old. He was 98 when I was writing the book. I just gathered as much as I could. And of course, it took me off in different directions as well, things that piled on top of other things. And today, and even now in the, since it was the 50th year of the capture, much more information has come out, and it's clear that many people in Germany, in German hierarchical, in the German diplomatic corps knew he was there, et cetera, that it was not this clean-cut kind of operation that we think about.
Great. Wait, excuse me, sir. We're going to, there are people with microphones, so please raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone next. Jody, do you have someone back there?
We'll get to you.
Oh, hi. I'm just wondering if you could, I remember photographs of Eichmann, and I just, his appearance never really transcribed to me, as to what kind of a person that was. I thought maybe you could make him into a human being, maybe, or describe.
I'm not sure I'm following your question, but his appearance.
So I think that he was, the interest is in Eichmann himself. What was he like as a human being?
What was he like as a human being? Well, he appears at the trial in a suit and a tie. He looks more, and no insult meant to accountants, but he looks more like a bank teller or an accountant than he does like a man who was responsible for the death of 1.5 million people. And many people think of him sort of as he looks very wimpy, kind of. But the moment when Hausner starts cross-examining him, by the way, Hannah Arendt is not in the courtroom then. She's vacationing in Germany with her husband and with Mary McCarthy, who is her close friend, and McCarthy's husband. And amongst the people they're visiting is Heidegger. But that's just a little throwaway. But in that exchange, is it Martha Newhouse? I think that's who is writing for The Atlantic. And she's present then. And then also Kessel, is it the famous French reporter and writer, who also writes about this in France, that when you watch Eichmann go to with Hausner, you saw the man. You saw the flashes of hatred, the flashes of anger. And sometimes Eichmann bests Hausner. Hausner's not, sometimes he's inept, sometimes he's very adept, but you saw this man come to life in a way that you didn't when he was sitting in that glass booth, sort of taking notes and twitching, which he did. He had this strange twitch.
And do you have someone in back, Laura? We need a microphone down here if you want to bring it down here. And how was the defense attorney?
The defense.
Is he any good?
No, well, I think he started right. Oh, okay. How was the defense attorney? I think he was mixed. I think the point he misses is he should have questioned Halevi's presence on the bench. They would have replaced him with someone else, but he doesn't, and no one quite knows why he doesn't. And he knows that he's not going to score points by beating up on the witnesses. How could you have seen this? Did you see Eichmann there or something like that? So more often than not, he plays a reserved role. Though there are points where he's, he criticizes the trial being held in Israel. He questions whether there is even an entity such as the Jewish people, which wasn't going to win him very many points in an Israeli courtroom. I don't think he's as good as. Nothing would have changed the outcome.
Right.
They had the goods on Eichmann, but I think he could have been more aggressive.
Sometimes these defense attorneys, there are a lot of international criminal trials going on now. That's part of the legacy of this. And sometimes the defense attorney is at odds with the defendant, and that the defendant in these cases often wants to paint their big nationalistic view of how patriotic they were, which is not really helping their case, and the defense attorney is really actually trying to get them, the lesser crime or a lesser sentence.
Well, Eichmann's defense was that I was just following orders, and I had no choice. And it's Halevi who gets them, actually. At the very end of the trial, the Israeli judges are allowed to question the defendant to make sure they fully understood, or if they feel that something he hasn't fully explained. It's an added defense for the defendant. So the judges question Halevi, they question Eichmann, and Halevi's questioning him, and he says to him, now, you didn't have anything against Jews personally. He said, oh, no, I even helped some Jews. He said, that's right, you had an Aunt Dorothy by marriage who was half Jewish, yes, and her daughter was almost going to be deported. I helped her escape to Switzerland. Then he says, so Levy says, you helped her escape to Switzerland. And Eichmann says, that wasn't the only ones. I helped other people too as well. And then Halevi says to him, so when you didn't want to follow orders, you didn't have to follow orders. that was
22. We've got a microphone here, and then I promise I'll get you one. Go ahead.
How did Israel deal with the death penalty issue?
Okay.
And what did they do with his body?
Okay, we're going to answer
Let's answer that.
Thank you.
How did Israel, it's a very important question. First of all, only 2 people in Israel's entire history have been given the death penalty. One, Eichmann. Anybody know who the second one is? Demjanjuk. And then Demjanjuk, the Ohio guard, who was charged with being Ivan the Terrible, found guilty, appeals to the Israeli High Court. And in one of the great, great moments of Israeli jurisprudence, the Israeli High Court says, it's clear you're not Ivan the Terrible. It's also clear you were Ivan the Very, Very Bad. You did terrible things, but you weren't the man you were brought here and charged as. And in a democratic system, even though what you did in that other case, you deserved the death penalty. In a democratic system, you can't say you were charged with this, you didn't do that, but you did this, which was equally terrible. You didn't kill that person, you killed someone else, so we're going to give you the death penalty for killing someone else. We don't do that in a democratic system, and they let him go. And so it wasn't carried out. So Eichmann was charged, was found guilty, was given the death penalty, and this is also interesting. The judges in Israel, there had been a ruling of the High Court that when a certain penalty is in part of a law, that judges are not obligated to give that penalty, but that's the maximum that can be given. So when the judges come out to give their decision in December of '61, They say, we do not feel we are obligated to give the death penalty by virtue of this case, which has the death penalty clause in it. So for a moment, Eichmann may have thought he escaped. He says, we don't, and then Landau said, we don't feel obligated, we feel you are deserving of it. We're not doing it because it's an obligation, but it's what you deserve. So he's hung when the High Court turns down his appeal, and then the president refuses to give him clemency. There's a whole debate. Martin Buber is involved in the debate with Ben-Gurion about whether he should die or not. He's hung, and his body is cremated. Israel doesn't have even facilities for cremation because Jews don't practice cremation, and neither did the Muslims, and I would guess, I know the Christians, and at least there were no available facilities, so they jerry-rigged some kind of cremation unit. His body is cremated, and then in order to prevent his place of burial from becoming a pilgrimage place, they take the ashes out to sea and they scatter them at the sea. So that's what happened.
This is becoming
It's coming, yes.
a current issue, yeah. Yes, go ahead.
I haven't read your book, and I haven't read Eichmann in Jerusalem. Something you said about Arendt's attitudes was very provocative to me, and I wish you'd expand on it a little bit. You said that she didn't really come to grips with Eichmann's anti-Semitism. I wish you'd say a little bit more about that. And then also something you just said, that she wasn't in Jerusalem at this critical point in the trial. How on earth did she have the heart to leave town? I'm wondering.
Well, she had, on the second question, she had made plans to meet for vacation and she left in May. She had come a few weeks before the trial began. The trial was postponed and began shortly after Pesach in April of '61. She was there till mid-May. She left for Brussels, I believe it was. She met up in Brussels Switzerland. It was Switzerland. With her husband and then with McCarthy and her husband. And they traveled together. Then she came back to Israel when Eichmann was being questioned by Servatius, by his own lawyer. But that was very bland. It was sort of a... And then she left either the first day, or actually, from what I can tell from the plane schedules, she left the morning that Hausner began to cross-examine him. What's more striking to me is that the New Yorker never acknowledged that. The book, both the articles and the book begin with Beit HaMishpat, which is House of Justice, which is the Israeli, we would say all rise, or in England, or whatever is said in particular countries. And she says, I went to Jerusalem to cover this trial. And it just seems striking. Not that you can't write a great trial book from transcripts. I hope I did. I wrote 2 great trial books when I was there, but when I wasn't. But to make it sound like you were an eyewitness and you missed that is just striking to me. In terms of the anti-Semitism, it's a very complicated question, and there are Arendt scholars on all sides of the fence who debate this a lot, but it's really striking to me that it's something that's so blatantly there that she won't see it. She doesn't see it. She sees this. It's the beginning with talking over dinner, and I think it's true. So Bruno over dinner, and that on some level, this is her view is the beginning of the universalization of the Holocaust. That this was something that happened to be perpetrated against Jews, but it's really a crime against humanity. Now, what's interesting, on some level, that is a much more accepted view today. I mean, why is there a Holocaust museum on the mall in Washington, on the National Mall? What's it doing there? It's there in part because though this is a crime against the Jews, it's a warning to the humanity at large about what you do, how you allow, when you allow something like this to happen, when you sit silently by. It has much bigger implications than just being the tragedy of one people. But simply the tragedy of one people wouldn't belong there. But it's got those bigger implications. So there's a certain irony that much of the way she sees it has become much more common today. But what she does fail to see is that anti-Semitism. It's there, but she just can't articulate it, and it's very strange for a very smart woman. But I'm not a psychohistorian, so I'm not going to try to.
Let's go back. We've got the microphone back here for a question.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering, just because it's such a hot button issue now as far as international trials for war criminals and/or terrorists, I'm wondering what the position of the United States was during this time as far as holding the trial actually in Israel, and whether or not this sort of international trial being held in Israel has acted as precedent for any other large international war criminal trials subsequently.
Well, America has a position in this. The only place where America officially speaks out is in the Security Council, when Henry Cabot Lodge engineers this sort of compromise. Initially, it looks like Lodge was going to vote for condemnation of Israel, and that's when Nixon, sort of calls him and gets him to see things differently. But legally, America does not speak out one way or the other, condemning or approving. So I don't think I don't think, as much as it's sort of nice to think, oh, maybe there's a historical precedent connection, I don't think there is in terms of American policy that I can see.
And did any other countries speak out?
Some countries were critical. Yes, some countries were critical. Most countries, the Western allies in the Security Council, were very happy with the compromise. It sort of resolved things, and people felt that was the best way. And then, of course, in the beginning, when Servatius, someone asked about Servatius, when Servatius, in the opening statement, he challenges the legitimacy of the trial because of how Eichmann is brought to trial. And Hauser, this is where the reporters get upset, and they go watch about Yuri Gagarin on the televisions in the reporter lounge, the snack bar, rather. Hausner goes through long explication of different cases from the United Kingdom, from the United States. There's a case from Idaho that he brings, sort of the fruit of the forbidden tree. It doesn't matter how the person is brought to justice. Once he's brought to justice, you can proceed with going ahead. And in part, it's sort of a message to the West that we are doing this. We are doing this legally, and it's some reporters see it as a tribute to Western justice, that Israel is saying, we know that this was done in an unorthodox fashion, but it's happened in your countries as well, and we're following that example.
Demjanjuk has been tried in Germany.
Pardon? Demjanjuk, yes, now he's
Has been tried in Germany now.
Yes, and found guilty and waiting on appeal.
Mm-hmm. And how was, can you talk a little bit about the negotiation with Demjanjuk in the United States?
Well, the United States, it's a long, long story. We'd be here all evening. It's a long...
The short version.
Right. The short version, Demjanjuk fights his extradition, but eventually he's extradited to Germany because he lied on his entry papers about what he had done during the war. And the Germans extradite him. And the important thing really is less Demjanjuk, but that Germany has now said that it's going to reinterpret its laws, and this will affect, at most a couple of dozen, but probably not even that many, that it doesn't have to have, on May 22nd, 1943, John Demjanjuk shot Chaim Klein of Krakow, but that they can take a more general view of how these crimes played themselves out. And for many years, Germany has refused to do that. So there might be a few. We really thought Demjanjuk was the final case, but there might be a few more cases after that.
Okay, question in the middle.
I have a curious question. In this country, famous serial killers, they do psychological profile, trying to see what makes them tick. Have they, during the trial period, between the time they captured Eichmann and the day he was executed, has anybody followed his psychological state of mind? Was he suicidal, depressed, elated?
Well, I don't know if they were very careful to prevent him from committing suicide. His light was kept on in his cell at all times. He had to sleep with his hands outside the blanket. There was a guard who watched him all times. There was another guard watching that guard, and a third guard watching that guard. None of them spoke German. They mainly were Sfaradim. because it felt that they would have less chance of wanting to kill him. So Israel was intent on not letting anything to happen to him. He was checked by a doctor continuously, and he was evaluated by psychologists who didn't find him normal. Aaron says they didn't find him normal. They found him capable of standing trial. So, but there wasn't the same sort of psychological profiles, I think, that we might have had today.
I'm wondering, it feels like at this particular moment, having just witnessed what happened in Libya this week, could you just
Well, when I watched what
that?
happened, listen, I think Gaddafi was one of the evil, Lockerbie, that's what you have to say. And Lockerbie wasn't the only thing, but, Lockerbie.
Right.
A man who a death sentence and a death penalty should have been slow and painful. Maybe that sounds vindictive, but he's a horrible, horrible man. Yet I was horrified by what happened, And it's regrettable that he wasn't made to stand trial. I think it would have been very important for the Libyan people. It would have been difficult. It would have been problematic. You're trying to rebuild the country. You're trying to establish a legal system, et cetera. But I think it was horrifying. I think the world was horrified by that. Look, on some level, I'm sorry bin Laden didn't stand trial. And let me say very clearly, I'm not being the least bit, in any manner, shape, or form, critical of the SEALs, what the SEALs did. It was a different case. Eichmann was a war that was over. Bin Laden was still a declared state of war in the United States. You were in potentially hostile territory. You didn't know if he was booby-trapped. You didn't know if the place was booby-trapped. There was apparently nothing else they could have done. But I just regret the fact. I would have liked to see him stand trial. Not for him, not that it would have changed his views of anything. Oh, look, you have a justice system. Maybe you don't deserve to be blown up or have planes fly into the World Trade Center. Not at all. But I think for us, I think for what it does for a people, when you see that horrible people can be brought to trial, that they can be given protection, and given rights, which is galling to think that these people would get rights. But they have those rights, and they get those rights, and yet justice can be done. I think it's very affirming for a country when that happens, and I think it's very important.
I think we should take one more question, Jody.
Okay.
Laura has a question back there.
Okay. At the beginning of your talk, you had mentioned how Eichmann was a lower-level person in the final solution. Who were the people above him, and exactly what were their fates?
Well, Himmler, who commits suicide, and Heydrich, who was assassinated in Czechoslovakia in '43, right, earlier on. Mueller, who is never brought to trial. And there were others. There were others, heads of camps, the commandant of Auschwitz. Well, he's not an architect of the final solution. There were people scattered all over, but I would say the people I mentioned are the main people, and either committed suicide or escaped, etc. But there were dozens, like Eichmann, of people, operatives on that level. Eichmann probably the most important of them, but there were dozens. Maybe that's too many. But there were a number of people who carried it out in various countries.
Well, Deborah Lipstadt, thank you
Thank you
for
all
a
very much.
wonderful evening.